Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third event this semester in the spring. We have two more events coming up. I'm Dr. Mehnaz Afridi. I am the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Center at Manhattan College. I'm also associate professor of religious studies, so I really welcome you. Our center focuses on the lessons of the Holocaust, and we also create awareness of other genocides, and we do a lot of interfaith work and also social and racial justice. So I'd like to welcome you and talk a little bit about our next two events. The first one is on April 1st at 7 p.m. And by the way, I know it's Passover starting in 2 days, so Chag Sameach, and I hope everything is clean already so you can be here tonight because tomorrow is Shabbat. So the first event is on April 1st, actually in Leo of Ramadan, which begins on April 12th. It's about the Quran, the first verse, Al-Fatiha, done by Dr. Hussein Rashid. So we're very excited to have him. Our second event is in remembrance of Yom HaShoah on April 8th with Joanne Sherm, who has written a book called My Dear Boy. It's a fascinating book and about her father, who was a survivor who went through Shanghai and different places, including North Africa, and came to the United States. So we have two more very exciting events for you in the spring, and I hope that you will join us. They're on our website, and they're always advertised on Facebook, as well as Instagram and Twitter. So I want to begin by saying how happy I am to have both Claudia and Eric here, and why this is such an important topic for me. I am a Muslim who works on anti-Semitism, and I also work on Islamophobia. And I work on very different genocides, like the Armenian genocide, Bosnian genocide. I've been working very closely with the Uyghurs and the Rohingya Muslims. And for me, the center represents not just talking about different genocides, but really talks about prejudice and racism and what happens to us when we don't pursue the lessons of the Holocaust or lessons of prejudice from our history. And so this becomes extremely important as I grow into this country as an American, but also look at what's happening around us. Recently, I was reading Hannah, a correspondence, which is huge, and I'll show you the book. It's a correspondence between Hannah Arendt and Karl Jaspers. Hannah Arendt was a German philosopher. She also was someone who covered the Ahmed trial in Jerusalem. And Karl Jasper was a psychiatrist and a philosopher, both being German. This correspondence started in 1929. And what I'd like to do is read you a quote from a letter that they resumed writing after the World War II in 1946 on January 29th. And it really was poignant for me in terms of what our climate is, who we are, and also the relationship between Jewish Americans and Black Americans today. She says, the fundamental contradiction in this country is the coexistence of political freedom and social oppression. The latter is, as I've already indicated, not total, but it is dangerous because the society organizes and orients itself along racial lines. And that holds true without exception at all social levels. From the bourgeoisie on down to the working class, this racial issue has to do with a person's country of origin. But it is greatly aggravated by the Black question. That is, America has a real race problem, and not just a racial ideology. You doubtless know that social anti-Semitism is taken completely for granted here, and that antipathy toward Jews is, so to speak, a consensus omnium. The Jews maintain an almost equally radical isolation, and of course, also protected by that isolation. A young Jewish woman, a friend of mine, born in this country, which is in America, she's in America right now, had in her home what I believe to be her first social meeting with non-Jewish Americans. This doesn't mean that people would not stand up for the Jews politically, but socially both sides want to keep to themselves, end quote. This was written in 1946, January 29th, and it resonated with me so much in terms of what we're going through as a country. And for me, as an educator, it's really important historically to share with my students the kind of history that has gone on in terms of racial, religious, political, economic prejudice. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce briefly both my colleagues and my friends. Dr. Claudia Setzer is in my department of religious studies. She's a professor, and her books include The Bible and the American Experience with also our colleague David Shefferman, The Bible in American Culture, a source book with David Shefferman, and Resurrection of the Body in Early Judaism and Early Christianity and Jewish Responses to Early Christians. She studies early Jewish-Christian relations, the development of belief in resurrection, women in the Greco-Roman era, 19th century women interpreters of scripture, and the Bible in American culture. She is currently writing a book on the issue of the Bible and progressive movements, abolitionism, women's suffrage, civil rights, environmentalism, and anti-trafficking. She earned her doctorate at Columbia University. And Claudia is a very dear friend of mine, and we spent Shabbat together. And so I'm really honored that she's here to be here for me, actually, in the center. So thank you, Claudia. And Eric, who I met, we were just talking a year and a half ago before COVID, and we presented together in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles. It has become sort of a brother because we've been talking about Long Beach, where we both lived, and we have connections about California and things. And Eric is really, if I would to say, and we don't use this term much, he's a civil rights activist. And that's something we don't really think about a lot these days. And I really admire the kind of work that he does. And I'm sure he's had about 3 other invitations today. And he's a very, very busy person, but I really am honored that you're here, Eric. He's the executive director of Western State Center, a nationally recognized expert in the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. In his 30-plus year civil rights career, he has worked with community groups, government, business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy as an organizer, director, program officer, consultant, and board member. He's wonderful to talk to, and I'm very lucky that you're here, Eric, tonight. Thank you. So what we're going to do tonight is have a conversation. I have some questions for both Claudia and Eric, and they will spend about 5 to 7 minutes on each question, and I'm hoping to have a lot of time for questions after that. So my first question to both of them, and first, if Claudia, you could start, is what did you see on January 6th at the Capitol Hill? How did it make you feel? And what did you observe?
Thanks, Maynaz, and thank you so much for having me. Well, you know, I, as a scholar, study the first century, so I read all these apocalyptic texts about this cosmic battle of good and evil, the forces of righteousness and the forces of chaos battling it out, this idea of this scary time. That's what it felt like. I had never identified with those texts much before until I clicked into CNN just to watch the orderly counting of electoral votes, and then I saw something starting to happen. This invasion of these forces of chaos and tribalism. And it really felt for a while that we were at a tipping point, that it really could go either way. It was not getting under control so quickly. So I was shocked. I mean, despite everything that's been happening the last 4 years, I just didn't think I'd ever see anything like that. Honestly, I thought of lynch mobs, of pogroms, of Emmett Till, of Kristallnacht, of all of these examples of this onrush of mindless, uncontrollable violence and bloodlust, often with the tacit approval of authorities. And the utter helplessness one must feel being caught, being trapped in those situations. There's no reasoning your way out of those. I also couldn't help but notice that the people who were perpetrating it did not seem to be the down and out and the marginalized. You know, many of them were middle class, you know, a business owner, a realtor, son of a judge. I think one of the great myths about Trump is that he somehow appealed to those forgotten and left out in society. That's a very comfortable narrative, but I think it covers over the fact that his election was really about race. I didn't really think about it from the perspective of being Jewish so much, but from the perspective of being American. Obviously, the Capitol riot revealed that anti-Semitism was, part of that whole poisonous brew. And of course, we all saw the man with the T-shirt that said Camp Auschwitz staff, and the gallows set up, which I since learned were a reference to the Turner Diaries, this book favored by white nationalists that says basically, there's going to be this day of the rope and all non-whites will be exterminated. And they warn the Jews that your day too is coming. You're one of those non-whites. I couldn't help but notice the religious overtones, all the Jesus 2020 flags with the same graphics as the Trump 2020 flags. And I understand there's a group there called the Jericho Marchers who blew, the ram's horn, the shofrot, and basically identified with story in Judges where Joshua and others destroy the city of Jericho. So they have this whole kind of religious underpinning to their violence. But with all of that, it was also familiar and it was also banal. You mentioned Hannah Arendt. She's the one who identified the banality of evil. It's just like, it's everything in the kitchen sink quality, the simplistic thinking and, turning everybody who's not you into the other. So on the one hand, it was shocking. On the one hand, it just seemed like more of the same old stuff.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. Eric, same question. What did you see? How did you feel? What did you observe? Unmute yourself.
Thank you for that, Minaz. And it's so good to see you, my friend. And just so thankful for your work. You teach us about the importance of understanding history, but you also have taught a lot of us to not let the tragedies of our histories prevent us from reaching out to one another and building relationships. And I'm honored to be part of this conversation. January 6th was a seminal moment for the United States. And it was seminal in the fact that this country, the public and the elected officials could no longer ignore the reality of white nationalism. White nationalism on January 6th in DC made itself known. But the truth is that it has made itself known for decades in this country, primarily in the West. I often refer to January 6th as in this way, that we finally saw the white nationalist movement move from the margins to the mainstream of American society. It was a critical moment for American democracy. Many of us now may forget the anxiety and the horror, but we almost watched democracy overthrown. We watched 140 law enforcement officers injured. 5 people were killed, including 1 law enforcement officer. But we saw something more frightening on that day, and it was the failure of our democratic institutions to prepare and effectively respond to what many civil rights activists had been warning about, not just for months, but for years. We weren't alone in this. 12 years ago, the Department of Homeland Security issued its own report, lifting up that white nationalists were the most significant terror threat inside the United States. It was a warning that was repeated for nearly a decade, and it went unheeded. The truth is while this violence may have culminated with the departure of Donald Trump on the day that democracy was actually attempting to work, it didn't start there. Honestly, Donald Trump just removed a scab to deep underlying issues that are impacting American inclusion and American democracy. On that day, we saw a coalition made up of many different tendencies, from hardcore white nationalists to alt-right unarmed paramilitary groupings such as the Proud Boys, to armed paramilitary groups such as the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters. Coupled in there were individuals who believed, because of false news reports, that the election had been stolen. But there were also gun rights activists, there were right-wing evangelicals, and many others. Though it may be confusing to understand these different tendencies, we should remember two things on that day. The first is, regardless of the different ideological tendencies, there was one goal, and the goal was to overthrow American government. We should not be confused. This was not a dispute around a specific issue or a regulation or a law. This was an attempt to overthrow the infrastructure of the United States. Having monitored the white nationalist movement and these paramilitary organizations for many decades, I can tell you something very clearly, that we are lucky that this was not more frightening than what we observed, that more lives weren't lost. We know that there was specific targeting on that day. It wasn't just a random event. There was an intent to carry out this act, that there appears that there was mapping of the Capitol grounds and offices, that law enforcement officers of color were in particular targeted with significant violence, and that Congress members were sought after in order to take hostage or to do them harm. This is what occurred, but it didn't come out of anywhere. The thing that I think we have to understand, Minaz, and I'll sum this up, is we should remember these groups didn't come bringing bigotry and their alienation and political violence with them. They merely organized what already existed in our communities around the country. Here in the Pacific Northwest and in the West, we have been experiencing this type of violence for decades: murders, beatings, and bombings, largely to the unbelief of the rest of America. We say now no one accuses us of hyperbole, but what does it mean to move forward? The first is to understand this, that there is another social movement that exists upon the terrain of the United States. And it is not a social movement that is grounded within inclusion. It's grounded into exclusion. Its goal is to overthrow democratic practice and to replace it with an authoritarian style government. It is driven by the idea of racism or white supremacy, the idea that people are inherently inferior because they don't have white skin. But it's also driven by something new that distinguishes it from white supremacy. It's driven by the belief that white supremacy, this system of exploitation, is a failed system. You see, just like civil rights activists, the white nationalist movement believes that white supremacy is a system that needs to go away. But while we seek to replace it with systems and regulations and communities grounded in equity, fairness, and inclusion, the white nationalist movement seeks to replace it with an all-white ethno-state that is free of people of color and Jews altogether. We should also understand that this movement has not gone away. What we saw on January 6th was not an aberration. Yes, the movement may have backed off by its own shock of its violence, but it has drawn a new line in America, and it is a line that they will seek to cross again. We've experienced that at state level government. We've experienced it with the spike in hate crimes. We should understand that white nationalism is a phenomenon that we must contend with. We aren't overreacting to it in this moment. We are underreacting, and we need more conversations to discuss what is to be done.
Okay, Eric, thank you. I mean, one of the reasons that I really wanted to have this conversation is, of course, coming from January 6th, but I think there's so much confusion on the relationship between certain groups that are targeted, right? Not not this us and them, but there's this sort of like multifaceted kind of confusion that I read in journals and magazines. And it's not just media. I'm talking about real academics, and I'm talking about intellectuals, and and the two groups that are constantly put into this, the two groups that are targeted, Jews and Blacks, are put in opposition to each other.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of whiteness in terms of that. So Claudia, I want to go to you because I think it's important that your work on anti-Semitism and your work on Black racism, perhaps you can tell us how you see the two prejudices intersect or completely depart from each other. And I know it's a very complex question, but I think this is why I'd like to have this conversation, so that we can kind of, tweeze out these areas of kind of vague oppositional groups that I think that are kind of creating more of a vast network of racism than we really need at this point. So Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we need to get rid of the idea that we can only talk about one kind of racism at a time, because there is a family resemblance between all these different kinds of racism. And of course, we have to mention the Asian American Pacific Islander suffering in the recent past. And I think that kind of bringing that forward to the consciousness. But I think both anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are subsets of white supremacy. And they're on a continuum with one another. Jews, for example, complicate the American myth of, say, the Puritans thought that they were Israel coming to settle this empty land and not noticing that anyone else was there. And Jews don't quite fit into that. Or even you think of Thomas Jefferson and, these self-evident truths and talking about nature and nature's God. Well, Jews interrupt those myths. First of all, they're not Christian. And they say, wait a minute, we're Israel, not the Puritans. And they define themselves by covenant, not by nature. So even though they were sort of honorary whites, the Naturalization Act, they were 1790 extended citizenship to them, is kind of honorary. But obviously, where you find anti-Black racism, you find anti-Semitism. They differ in degree, and I just want to say that I think being Jewish in America, if you are a white Jew, is not like being Black. I mean, if my son gets stopped in his car by a police officer, he doesn't have to worry in the same way as if he were Black, and I think we need to recognize this. But of course, we're not competing with one another. We're on a continuum. And I do want to say a little bit about Jews and whiteness, because I find that sometimes people don't take anti-Semitism very seriously, especially progressives. Often when you have a roster of prejudices to attack, anti-Semitism doesn't show up on there. And that's why I appreciate Maynaz so much and Eric's work as well. I think it's because of the perception that Jews are white, that Jews equal whiteness. And of course, it is easy to look at your neighbors and think, well, gee, first of all, they look white, my Jewish neighbors, and gee, they're doing pretty well and they're well educated and professional class. And, why don't these Jews just stop complaining about anti-Semitism already? And it is true, of course, that Jews as a group have flourished in America. But there's two things that I would say. One is not all Jews are white. Estimate in this country is roughly 13 to 15% of Jews are Jews of color. And in Israel, it's roughly half. Jews are Mizrahi or Middle Eastern or of Middle Eastern origin, or Beta Israel or Ethiopian Jews. So we have to get rid of the idea that Jewish equals white. But in the US, obviously, the majority of Jews are Ashkenazim, descended from Central and Eastern European Jews, and they have white skin, and that confers white privilege. But I think that's a very recent thing, and I think it's unstable, and I think people sometimes don't realize that. Anti-Semitic acts have been going up generally. 2020 was kind of an anomaly, of course, because of COVID, but 2019, the ADL recorded 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents across the US, harassment, vandalism, etc., assaults, which is the highest number that they've had since they started keeping records. And they've basically just been going up the last few years, part of a general surge in hate crimes as a group. And, I'll just mention a few. January 6th, of course, had its anti-Semitic element. 2019, there was a shooting in a synagogue in California. Some were killed. And that same year, a rampage at a kosher market in Jersey City. In 2018, of course, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was shot up, killing 11. 2017, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, etc., where they shouted, "Jews will not replace us." And Eric was mentioning this whole idea of the replacement theory that's just always been there. This idea that people are worried that, that the rightful heirs of America, the white people, are going to be replaced by non-whites. So these are very dramatic incidents. There are more mundane incidents like college students being harassed if they support Israel. So I think, and I don't want to give a whole huge lecture here, but anti-Semitism is both very old and new. It's old in the sense that you still see these ancient stereotypes of Jews as anti-Christian. They were the source of the Black Death. The Middle Ages, the 19th century ideas of Jews as racially inferior, class lower on the evolutionary scale, along with Asians and Africans. Conspiracy theories about Jews that we saw in the 19th century in the protocols, the Elders of Zion. This idea that Jews are some international group plotting to subvert governments. All these are old ideas, but they never seem to go away. They never seem to wither. And then on top of that, layered on top of that, you have new ideas, because anti-Semitism, in maybe all prejudice, is sort of protean. It kind of seems to wrap around new events. And you really see the family resemblance of all hatreds. We think about how Asian Americans have been targeted because of the pandemic. Well, so have Jews. And Ireland, if you could show this picture from the ADL, this was on social media recently. So this is the conspiracy theory, and that's just classic. First of all, Jews as ugly and physically inferior, but also that they're somehow behind the COVID epidemic, out to subvert society. And there they are behind, he's holding a syringe, they're behind big pharma, probably out to make money and to undermine society. And similarly, there's this, all these classic ideas. And similarly, there's another picture down there where COVID is a Trojan horse. And inside, of course, are the Jews, that it's a way for the Jews to get into the larger society and undermine it. So whatever comes along, it just kind of seems to adapt to whatever new events are out there, and tap into these classic themes of the cunning and the physical inferiority of Jews. Another thing that's kind of new is, and Eric mentioned this, it's more acceptable. It's more mainstream. You think of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who touted these crazy conspiracy theories of Jews and space lasers starting California wildfires. But she's not some nut, some social misfit living in a shack somewhere. She's a member of Congress. And the other thing that is new is, of course, that social media gives a platform and a reach to all of these crazy ideas way beyond what was available, say, when I was growing up. There's no natural break on these ideas. So it's both old and new. I did, by the way, notice something encouraging. It used to be if you went to Google and you put in the word Jew, very quickly something would come up from stormfront.org, some really anti-Semitic website. And I did it recently and nothing like that came up. So there may be some way in which Google is trying to clean up its act a little bit. I hope so.
I'm surprised like Eric and Mehnaz didn't come up when you typed in Jew.
That's right.
Yeah, there is that.
That is that. So, that's perfect. Thank you, Claudia. So, Eric, your work is it's very interesting to me. And it's kind of like, I feel like we're kind of like a negative, positive of each other if we had a photograph, right? So you work, right? So I also work on Islamophobia, but also have to talk about anti-Semitism before I could talk about Islamophobia. You talk about anti-Semitism and then Black racism, but you do this marvelous thing about looking at, you know, not just the history, but how it cannot function without that platform, and how that platform becomes the step onto which these groups go on, right? So could you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, if I had all night, I would unpack it over hours. But you know, to be succinct, which is, you know, is hard for me, but I'm going to be succinct. What we have to understand is, so we have a system called white supremacy, right? And even saying the word, there are studies that show make our anxiety go up, right? Even just hearing the word or saying it. And there's lots of reasons for that. But for a second, I'm going to have folks just take a deep breath. We're going to talk about white supremacy for a second. And it's important for folks to know none of us were around when white supremacy was invented. We didn't create it. It is a system that has socialized us. And it was a system upon which society organized itself. And it was based off of chattel slavery. It was based off the genocide and theft of lands from indigenous communities and the control of sexuality, primarily the control of women. That is the system that allowed us to organize economically, politically, and culturally in the society. It was the lens upon which we understood politics, culture, economy, etc. Then in the 1960s, I'm jumping a little bit, but bear with me, along comes this 1960s civil rights movement led by Black folks that overthrow white supremacy as the rule of law. So I'm not saying, Manaz, that white supremacy doesn't still exist. What I'm saying is that it became contested terrain, no longer de jure, but largely de facto. Now imagine you are a person socialized in Jim Crow and separate but equal, all of the tenets and practices of white supremacy. How then do you come to terms with that you've just suffered your greatest political defeat against a grouping of people that you see as inferior in each and every way? Do you all of a sudden say, well, I guess Black people aren't inferior after all, and they out-organized us and they drew a larger moral line? Not likely. But people needed an explanation, particularly if you were a hardcore segregationist who believed in white supremacy. It is in that explanation, right, within the victory of the civil rights movement, that anti-Semitism takes on a new form of life. Just like anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism also evolves. And how it evolved in the United States is that it became seminal to the founding of white nationalism, or the backlash against civil rights in this country. Let me explain really quickly. Folks weren't going to give credit to Black folks because that would mean acknowledging their humanity. That would mean giving up the concept of white superiority. Instead, they borrowed from a conspiracy they may have learned as World War II veterans in Europe, or may have been exposed to because of Henry Ford, who was a rich automobile industrialist. Regardless of where the source is, they came across a powerful narrative. It was a narrative called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic fake document that purported to tell a story of Jewish elders gathering in a cemetery at midnight to plot the takeover and the destruction of European Christendom. It is this narrative that was adopted. In short, if white supremacy is written upon the paper of anti-Black and indigenous racism, white nationalism, the social movement, is grounded upon anti-Semitism. And it isn't just a core of white nationalism, it is the core. And it's so central to white nationalism that I, as a civil rights activist who is Black, believes that we actually don't achieve equity nor equality in this society without also tackling anti-Semitism. It's because amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demon stirring a pot of lesser evils and the driving force behind white dispossession. At that foundation is a modern day claim by white nationalists that Jews are a separate race. And this is important for us to understand. The evolution of anti-Jewish bigotry has shifted, right? That bigotry from being an anti-religious or an anti-cultural form to actually seeing Jews as a racialized race. And it is that piece and the white skin of a large proportion of Jews in this country that infects this whole conspiratorial narrative. White nationalists argue that because Jews are seen as white, right, that they are in fact an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. It is that fantasy of Jewish power that explains for white nationalists and those surrounding them how a race of supposed inferior Black folks could orchestrate a civil rights movement, or how the LGBTQ community, right, and feminists could orchestrate, right, a conversation, right, that rejects kind of the narrow definitions of relationships and families in the society, or even how immigrant workers could organize effectively against or for economic equity. Everywhere that white nationalists see a problem in this society, they also place this nefarious conspiracy of Jews secretly at work to destroy the white race. That is why over the last 4 years and at the Capitol, we saw signs and t-shirts, right, that suggested, right, that COVID was a Jewish plot, or that the elections were a Jewish fraud that sought to destroy the white race. We have to understand that at the end of the day, anti-Semitism provides the oxygen for this social movement. And it's why I often say to folks, particularly when the Jewish community asks me how they can best support the movement for Black lives, I think I shock them because my response is, what can the Jewish community do to fight racism? Fight anti-Semitism even harder, because anti-Semitism is also a form of racism. Now, it may not be a racism that Black folks experience or Latinos experience. I'm not trying to create a comparison. What I'm saying, though, is that it is a racialization of a community. And like all forms of racism, it isn't just a behavior, it's also a system. And what I mean is that anti-Semitism isn't just taking the lives of Jews, it's also killing the rest of us. Latinos died in a Walmart in El Paso because the conspiracy infected shooter thought he was at war with a Jewish cabal. 9 worshipers died in a Charleston church, not just because they were Black, but also because the shooter believed he was at war with a Jewish conspiracy. You scratch below the surface of most mission-oriented hate crimes against Sikhs, Muslims, Jews, Blacks, and Latinos in this country, and you will find the equal opportunity poison that is the ideology of anti-Semitism. In short, for me, as a Black civil rights activist, anti-Semitism is also anti-Black. It denies the agency and the legitimate grievances of our community, wrapping it up in a conspiracy. It is that conspiratorial narrative that has helped to kill 1 out of every 550 Black people from COVID-19 in the last year alone, right? It is that conspiracy, right, and that narrative style thinking that has created QAnon, also based off the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. What we have to understand is that anti-Semitism is an effective narrative because it is an attractive story. It creates a conspiratorial elite. It places individuals in the center of this very exciting story. It gives them a false sense of power that says that they are one of the few folks who understand what is going on. But it's a bankrupt narrative. It provides no real answers to the real problems in our society. What it does produce is high levels of political violence, high levels of alienation, and a form of terror that the Jewish community has to live with each and every year, but not just the Jewish community. The rest of us also experience anti-Semitism each and every day.
Wow. Thank you, Eric. That was very powerful. And, it might, this is what I do with Muslim communities too, is talk about Islamophobia and the roots of that and how we need to think about racism and not, as we call it in genocide studies, not the Olympics of genocide, right? Your suffering is your suffering. It is not less or more than the other person's suffering. And I think that's an important message. And I think that's kind of what you're trying to talk about, but you're talking about it in different ways. So my last thoughts, and we'll take questions from the audience. I think if you can put it in the chat, but just, for both of you to sort of ruminate on how do you think the relationship between Jewish Americans and Black Americans is today? How do you reflect on that?
Yeah.
Claudia?
Well, there's a number of things. I just want to respond a little bit, I guess, to some of the things that Eric said is just so interesting, because you're right that white supremacy turns Jews into a race. And of course, that's not how we think of ourselves. We think of ourselves as a culture or religion, they're racial elements, but it sort of has redefined Jews in a way that we don't necessarily recognize. I guess I'd say a couple, and one other thing that I just wanted to say to respond to Eric is I think that we Jews are not exempt from thinking about racism because we've experienced discrimination, that we are therefore incapable of racism. Susanna Heschel talks about that iconic picture of her father marching in Selma with Martin Luther King, but she notes that in the back you see a sign for Tepper's. Tepper's was a department store owned by a Jew named Saul Tepper, who was a white supremacist, segregationist. He belonged to the White Citizens Council. So I think there, as you are saying, it's important for Blacks to think about anti-Semitism. For everyone, it's important for Jews to be involved in anti-racist activity. I think there's a lot of good things going on. I have actually a fairly hopeful view. There are all these kinds of Jewish progressive groups, TRUA, which is the Human Rabbis for Human Rights, Bend the Arc, all these Jewish organizations that are working in various anti-racist initiatives, protecting asylum seekers, et cetera. I saw there was something recently called the Black Jewish Entertainment Alliance. It was just formed like recently, 170 people in the entertainment industry who are trying to kind of start a new civil rights movement and thinking about, if you think about the impact of people of color and Jews in the entertainment industry, music, comedy, film, et cetera, that's just, that industry wouldn't exist without Blacks and Jews. So I think that's kind of exciting. My own synagogue in Riverdale has a very nice friendship with the Creston Avenue Baptist Church. And it's a friendship. They come to our services, we go to their services. We have a Thanksgiving meal that we put out for the community and just listen to each other. And I really honor our leaders, Rabbi Barry Katz and Pastor Marcia Stanley, who just really made that work. Maybe I'm naive, but honestly, I don't hear racism from my Jewish friends, and I don't hear anti-Semitism from my Black friends. I'm actually quite hopeful. Maybe in some strange way, Trump has done us a favor and reminded us that we belong to each other, and when one group is attacked, the other is attacked. Let's see, if I could just say one more thing, it's very easy to call out people on the alt-right and on the far right. They're vulgar, they're obvious. It's a little harder when it's people closer to home, more progressive groups. You think of the Women's March and stuff like that. All right, but I think I probably said enough. So we need time for questions.
Eric, you want to just say a little bit about Jewish-Black relations in America?
Yeah, so one of the things I want to say, and hopefully I'm not on mute, good, I'm off mute, so I have that going for me. Look, the first thing I'm going to say, which is probably going to make everyone grimace, it's complicated, right? So I'm not sure if there is more tension between Black and Jewish communities. What I think is that anti-Semitism and racism in America are functioning in the manners that they're supposed to. So what I mean by that is, look, we have to understand anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States. That is not left or right anti-Semitism. That is not Republican or Democratic anti-Semitism, right? That's not conservative or liberal anti-Semitism. There's just anti-Semitism and how some folks choose to tap into it. That is the same when we're talking about racism or we're talking about anti-Muslim bigotry / Islamophobia. At the end of the day, right, there are numerous studies that show us that in times of great change in a society, right, that bigotry is much more likely to make itself manifest, right, consciously. We know much more about the human brain than we've known, right? We've learned more in the last 10 years about the human mind than we have the entire history of humanity. And one of the things we know is that bias resides in the unconscious part of the brain. And that under stress, that bias comes forward. That we can live with and deal with. What's harder to deal with is the inability or the unwillingness of our institutions, right, to implement systems of equity to try to counter that bias when it appears. And that's how we've landed in the moment we are right now. In terms of Black-Jewish relationships, it just depends where you're talking about it, right? Clearly, aspirationally, the 1960s provides a framework upon which Jews and Blacks came together to struggle around civil rights. It was a civil rights movement that was largely led, right, almost not nearly all led, by Black people in the South. However, Jews played a role. Now, that's a mixed role, right? Primarily, the largest level of support, as I understand it from polling and data, is from Jews out of the North, and largely not communal Jewish organizations, but individuals who operated outside their Jewish communal organizations. However, there is a myth that somehow Jews showed up to really show allyship to the Black community. And I want to reframe that. I think the Jewish community showed up for two different reasons. The first was the moral calling of their own faith and culture as a people, right? And this idea of healing the earth, their own, and healing the world. That was a catalyst for younger Jews, right, who saw what was going on, who remembered, or at least had learned stories of what had happened to their grandparents in the pogroms in Eastern Europe. But there was something else. Jews also had legitimate skin in the game, a self-interest in the victory of the civil rights movement. The problem is that anti-Semitism already, right, begins to poison that very statement. The idea that I, as a non-Jew, can say that Jews have legitimate self-interest, somehow that seems nefarious, right? That Jews might have a self-interest. But look, Black people have self-interest, Muslim community has self-interest, right? Poor communities have self-interest. There's nothing wrong with self-interest. Self-interest only becomes problematic if it's gained at the real loss of and humanity of other communities. What was the self-interest of the Jewish community in the civil rights movement? It was one, for racism not to spread in American society, because when racism and prejudice spreads, the Jewish community always eventually becomes a victim of that. The second was the Immigration Reform Act, right, which was one of the three cornerstone pieces of legislation of the 1960 civil rights movement. The first being the Voting Rights Act, the second being the Civil Rights Act. The Immigration Act, right, replaced the white supremacist policies in American immigration law that prevented Jews from fleeing pogroms, right, and the Holocaust in Europe. It prevented the Frank family from entering the United States, and we ultimately know what the cost was paid by that family, right, in the European Holocaust against Jews. We should understand that at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with that self-interest. The Black community I'm thankful that the Jewish community showed up so visibly in the 1960s. That is a story of the Black and Jewish community working well together. But there are also stories of the Black and Jewish community not working well together. And in those cases, let's be clear, it's not because Jews were Jews. It was because Jews were immigrants. And there has always been tension between the Black community and new immigrant communities. That has nothing to do with the immigrants, right? But everything to do with white supremacy and the positioning of Blacks in the society as the faces at the bottom of the well, right? Continuously stepped over, right? As others are able to gain their opportunity, largely, right? Benefiting from the Black civil rights struggle. That is Black resentment. And I don't say that it is properly placed, but we do understand why it exists in this society. At the end of the day, Black and Jewish relationships are complicated. We should not draw a broad brush. What we can do is look at a perfect case study, the 1960s, where Blacks and Jews found themselves in order to establish a more inclusive America. That is something worth looking at, but we should not use it to try to draw larger ideas about what that complicated relationship is like. It's a relationship that's like any other communities. But I'll say one thing, Minaz, because I know we're close on time, which is this. We have to understand, though, that this racialization of Jews, right, is really dangerous, right? It undercuts, right, the civil rights movement, but it also increases the potential for other religious minorities, right, to face the same fate. And I have to say, we're all watching the tragedy that happened in Boulder, Colorado. And I have to note that I am watching both elected officials, right, and far-right individuals who are using anti-Muslim bigotry, right, to stir it up. But their comments are not framed as Muslims being a religious other, but a racial other. So Islamophobia in this country may follow the same path as anti-Semitism, the racialization of the Muslim community. And I will just predict this, for Black folks who are listening, we want to get out ahead of that too, because it will negatively impact us as well.
Wow. We do have some time because I don't want to ignore all the questions. So Arlen, maybe 2 questions that you could choose from the chat.
Yeah. So the first question we have says, the idea that the Jews are doing fine is anti-Semitic. We are not a monolith, but when anti-Semitism comes from the left, they use this anti-Semitic concept to falsely explain away anti-Semitism. People often say you're not a race to try and tell people that anti-Semitism isn't racism, even though that is just semantics. We have anti-Semitic sitting members of Congress and people excuse them. How do we counter these narratives?
Yeah, so we should understand that anti-Semitism has a number of tropes, right? And one of the tropes is that all Jews are wealthy, right? But these are contradictory tropes, right? We know the trope, all Jews are capitalists, right? We also know the trope, all Jews are communists, right? We know the trope, Jews are stingy, but we also know the anti-Semitic trope, right? That Jews are altruistic. The fact is that the Jewish community is as diverse as any other community. And the way that we push back against this is you have to stop worrying about whether anti-Semitism comes from the left or right. That's not even how we should be framing the problem. When we frame it that way, we're already cementing ourselves as being partisan, right? It doesn't matter where anti-Semitism comes from. What matters is how we choose to respond to it. We respond to it by always speaking out against it, right? But we also respond to it by not treating every single person who makes an anti-Semitic remark as if it's coming out of the mouth of David Duke or Louis Farrakhan, right? That does not move this conversation forward. The third is we have to understand, right, that we live in a society that has never really had a real conversation on anti-Semitism. So we are asking people to have a higher level of concept around an issue that they've never been exposed to, particularly people of color and poor folks who don't have access to these great public schools or private schools that other folks get to go to, or these great colleges with great programs. That's not how most Americans live their lives. So we have to understand, we have to distinguish between those who use anti-Semitism out of ignorance and those who use anti-Semitism in order to try to organize politically. Those who try to use it to organize politically, we need to be aggressive in pushing back to them. We need to understand whether it was intentional or ignorance. If ignorance, right, we have to have a path to repair, not to shut folks down. At the end of the day, we need to be able to speak about anti-Semitism at such a level that we begin to build people's muscle in how to handle it, talk about it, and understand it. I often say this, right? There are so many anti-Semitic tropes. Globalist, right, gets used all of the time, right? Everyone thinks that they're really talking about globalists. We all know what that word is. We should know it as well as if someone said, Eric, I want to talk to you about crime and thugs. I know who you mean when you say thugs. I know who you mean when you say welfare queen or affirmative action baby. I know exactly what those dog whistle politics are. We have to become that literate in terms of anti-Semitic tropes. And then we have to be brave enough to start speaking about them. And the best way to become brave and courageous and good at countering these things is to start practicing. We have to practice a discussion around understanding anti-Semitism.
I could respond also. I would just say two short things. One is something's got to be done about social media. Maybe it already has been. Some sort of control of things. I know we all reject censorship and all of that, but it's just it's just something that feeds on itself and, expose everyone. And also the control of hate speech. Compared to other countries, we are very tolerant of hate speech in this country. And I'm not so sure that should continue to be the case.
Great. Our next question is from Professor Drewby, and that is, how do you see these issues as related or not to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so I struggle with this. I'll be curious to hear from others. Where I struggle is I don't understand within the construction, at least, of white supremacy in America, the difference between Christian and white. It seems often that Christian has become a euphemism for European Christianity. Now, I don't know if that's true, but we also have to say that there is a long line of anti-Jewish bigotry and then anti-Semitism that runs through Christianity that makes it easy to tap into. So look, we are in a moment right now, right? And it's not just on the far right, where we are really having to wrestle with a deep fundamentalism and authoritarianism that's not just part of political movements, but has become part of the culture of our society. And always within that culture, I promise you, it's 5 steps to anti-Semitism, right? And to the narrative of anti-Semitism. It doesn't have to be spoken, right? It's the patterns of this idea that you're in an existential war against good and evil, and that evil must be vanquished, right? And that evil is tricky or sneaky. These are the tenets of anti-Semitism. So it doesn't surprise me that in this moment, right, we are seeing also a rise in this new form of white supremacy called Christian nationalism. Maybe not so new.
If I could jump in too, Paul, I think that they're identical. And I differ with Eric a little bit in that he was kind of minimizing it before. And I don't think the religious stuff ever went away, even though it's more ancient. I think things just layer on top of each other. For example, in the Tree of Life synagogue, the shooter went in saying Jews are children of the devil. That is straight out of the Gospel of John. And, that's a medieval trope. The idea the Jews are satanic, those are like medieval tropes coming out of Christianity. So I think that those things never went away. I think the religious elements are always there. And they're basically identical. These religious tropes are always there to be used for anybody's purposes. And, we saw on January 6th, you saw people praying and things like that using religious symbols. So again, it's back to that whole idea of Jews interrupting the whole Christian nation idea and going back to the Puritans even. Okay, enough history lesson.
Great. And our last question of the night is, do you think that the division between upper class, middle class, and lower class communities plays a role in racism segregation? If so, how closely are they connected?
Well, racism plays the role of segregation in society, but let's be clear, right? The layer of equity, particularly economic equity, really matters, right? It is the ability to survive racism in the society or not to survive it. And I think of, when I think of the white nationalist movement, when I think of like extremist movements, but I think of American society as a whole, we shouldn't draw a correlation between economic pressure and bigotry. A study done by Professor James Aho at the University of Idaho, it's the only comprehensive study on white nationalism that I've ever read. It's called The Politics of Righteousness, Christian Patriotism in Idaho. He did a study, this came out, I think, in the mid 90s, late 90s. And his study found that the white nationalist movement in Idaho had a lot higher level of education than the general population as a whole, that it had a higher level of income and was more politically active. That seems to resemble other authoritarian movements that we see around the world, whether we're talking about the French National Front, right? Whether we're talking about the British National Party, other social movements that are grounded in authoritarianism and in a belief in political violence. The reason, though, I'm going to make an argument, though, even though economic displacement isn't a driver, I think we are still called to address it, because these movements will use it as a vehicle to recruit people. And it will do so by using it as a way of saying, see, it's an excuse, because larger society does this all of the time. We spend a lot of time excusing political and racial violence based off of the perceived economic pressure that society is facing. We see this each and every day, but it's not always economics. And sometimes it's cultural. And I will always remember September 11th, right? And I will always remember the level of hate crimes targeting those who are perceived to be Muslim or Arab that occurred in the week following. And it skyrocketed. And then there was a moment when those hate crimes simply dropped off, right? And it was the moment when John Ashcroft and George W. Bush took to the airwaves and said, right, hate crimes targeting our Muslim neighbors will not be tolerated. And we will prosecute, right? And take individuals to trial who engage in that. There was almost a direct relation in the drop off of hate crimes. And I asked myself a question at that time. Was it simply that on September 11th, folks kind of just began and adopted anti-Muslim bigotry? Or was it that they felt permission to act on that bigotry on September 11th until elected officials said, no, you cannot? I think it's the latter. And that's why we can't make excuses for bigotry. Lots of people in our society live under economic pressure, are socially alienated. They don't spend their time targeting other vulnerable and marginalized communities. We have to draw a clear moral barrier. But yes, we have to address the underlying inequalities in our society. We can't put forward a vision, right, of a hypocritical America as the counterpoint to white nationalism. We have to put forward an inclusive democracy that is people-centered, transparent, and accountable. One that actually seeks to meet the basic needs of Americans in this society and to give us a pathway to opportunity and prosperity. Again, most people simply want to live, love, worship, and work in our society. And if we can't provide those basic things through a democratic practice, we are bound to lose.
Claudia, do you want? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just thinking a little bit about economics and status. I'm thinking of the model minority myth, which of course is used, applied to Jews, to Asians, to South Asians, which is ultimately meant, I think, to pit groups against each other. And it's ultimately a racist idea, but it promotes this idea that, well, anybody can get ahead in society. See, look at this group, they did it. And therefore, there is no such thing as privilege. So I'm just thinking about that, how that is kind of insidious because it seems positive. It seems like you're saying good things about these model minorities, but in fact, you're putting the groups against each other and you're denying the reality of racism and economic injustice and economic inequity. So that's what that made me think of.
Eric, quick question from,
Yeah.
I don't know who it was, but somebody wants to know if you have a book they can read.
Huh. You know what? I wish I had that time to write a book someday, but I do have,
Article.
The article I would point folks to, if you Google Eric Ward and Skin in the Game, both of those things, you'll get one of the articles that I wrote. Look, this article is going to seem so conventional wisdom now, but it was actually written before Charlottesville. And so I think it's timely. The other is if you look at, if you Google Western State Center and Medium, right, the website, you'll also find other articles that I've written, including further articles on anti-Semitism. I should write a book. It's a great idea.
Come on, Eric. We're pretty. So everyone, thank you.
2026.
I know it's past 8. It's 8:12, which I'm happy that people are so engaged and still here. I really appreciate Claudia and Eric and everyone. Give them a hand. Thank you so much, both of you. I think this is an ongoing conversation, and perhaps we should revisit this conversation in the fall. I think this is not something that we can just do in an hour. Perhaps, we can continue it in the fall or maybe have, a roundtable or something like that. So look out for more of Eric and Claudia. And thank you so much. And I thank everyone for coming to HDI events, and hopefully see you on April 1st, although I know it's Passover, or I'll see you on April 8th, which is Yom HaShoah, Remembrance Day. And I'm hoping that some of our students will be involved in the remembrance of the Holocaust. So good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maynaz. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Excellent.
Thank you, Mana and Claudia. Wonderful.